The courthouse in Fairfax County smelled the way all courthouses smell of old paper and institutional carpeting and the particular kind of patience that only exists in places where decisions are made that cannot be unmade. Margaret Elaine Greer Whitfield sat in the third row of the public gallery with her hands folded in her lap and her back perfectly straight, and she watched the lawyers move through the hallway with the focused attention of someone who has learned to read a room the way other people read a book, quickly, thoroughly, without missing anything important. She was 70 years old. She was wearing a navy suit she had bought specifically for this occasion, not because she wanted to impress anyone in this building, but because she had been raised by a man who believed that when something mattered, you dressed like it mattered. The suit fit well. She had lost 12 pounds in the past 8 months, not from grief, but from eating with attention for the first time in decades, cooking what she wanted, tasting things properly without the continuous background calculation of someone else's preferences, shaping every meal. 8 months, that was how long it had taken to get from a folder falling on a hardwood floor to this room, to this chair, to this particular Tuesday morning in March. She had not expected it to be fast. She had not wanted it to be fast. Speed in her experience was what you chose when you were afraid that patience would cost you something. She was not afraid of that anymore. She looked at the clock on the wall across the gallery. Patricia Holt would be inside the courtroom now, laying documents on the table with the methodical efficiency of someone who has spent 40 years understanding that the law is at its foundation, a system of paperwork, and that the person with the better paperwork almost always wins. Maggie had given Patricia very good paperwork. Her father had made sure of that 18 years before Maggie needed it, in a way that still moved her when she let herself think about it directly. She did not let herself think about it directly right now. Right now, she was watching a young man in a gray suit argue with someone on his phone at the far end of the hallway, and she was thinking about how 8 months ago she had not known she would be sitting in this building, in this chair with this particular quality of calm that had no anxiety in it at all. 8 months ago, she had only known the smell of burning toast. It had been a Tuesday morning in July, warm already at 9 o'clock, in the way that Northern Virginia summers are warm. A heaviness in the air that the air conditioning inside the house pushed back, but never quite defeated. Douglas had left for work at 7:30, same as always. The same dark blue Lexus that he replaced every 3 years. The same coffee thermos he'd carried since their daughter Claire had given it to him 7 Christmases ago. The house had settled into its daytime quiet. Maggie had been in the kitchen reviewing the household accounts on her laptop, the way she did every Tuesday morning, the habit of 45 years. She managed their finances with the precision she had learned as an assistant director at a commercial real estate firm before their marriage in 1978, a precision that had never left her, even though the job had absorbed gradually into the management of a house and a marriage and a life that she had built so carefully. She had stopped seeing the architecture of it clearly. She smelled the burning before she heard the alarm. The toaster. She had been meaning to replace it for months. She closed the laptop and went to check the kitchen burst, unplugged the toaster, and then went room by room, through the downstairs the way she always did when something was off, methodically without hurrying, because hurrying was what you did when you were not sure what you were looking for. She came to Douglas's office last. She had always come to Douglas's office last, or not at all, because the office was his. That had been the unspoken arrangement of their marriage, one of many arrangements she had accepted over the years, without ever sitting down to examine why she had accepted them. The rest of the house was shared territory. The kitchen where she had cooked 45 years of meals. The living room where they had raised Claire. The bedroom where she had spent 4.5 decades beside a man she had believed she knew completely. But the office was his. She knocked before entering. She did not open his desk drawers. She had never touched the filing cabinet in the corner. She had observed these rules not because Douglas had demanded them, but because she had internalized them over so many years that they had become invisible, the way the rules of a space eventually become the shape of the space itself, and you stop seeing them as rules at all. You simply behave as though they are the natural order of things. The office smelled clean. The toaster smell had not reached this far. She was already turning to leave when the sleeve of her cardigan caught the corner of a folder that was sitting on the edge of Douglas's desk, a position she registered as unusual. Even as her arm moved a folder that should have been in the filing cabinet or in the leather bag he carried to work. Not here, not at this angle, as though it had been set down quickly rather than placed with intention. The folder hit the floor. The papers inside spread across the hardwood in a fan shape. Maggie stood and looked at them. She would think about this moment later many times in the months that followed. The exact quality of the 3 seconds she spent looking at those papers before she made any move to pick them up. Because she understood, standing there, that she was at a threshold. That if she crossed it, if she picked those papers up and read them, certain things would become true that could not be made untrue again. Some knowledge once received cannot be returned. She understood that with a clarity that felt almost physical, a sense of the weight of the moment pressing against her before she knew what was in it. She crossed the threshold. She picked the papers up. They were bank statements. She recognized the format immediately. She had been managing household finances for 45 years, and she knew what a bank statement looked like. The way a carpenter knows what a joint looks like without having to think about it. But the account number was not familiar. The bank was not one she recognized. And the balance was large enough that she read it twice carefully to be certain she had the decimal point in the right place. She did. She stood in the middle of Douglas's office and read the transaction history with the concentrated attention of someone who processes numbers professionally, which she had been once and which a part of her mind had never stopped being. Monthly payments to a private school in Richmond. She recognized the city did not recognize the school. The amounts were consistent with elite private school tuition. Monthly rent payments to an address in Richmond. Also unfamiliar. Grocery store charges. Clothing stores categorized for children. A pediatrician's office. A barbershop that clearly served a family rather than a single adult. The life of a family, a complete functioning family, paid for from this account for 16 years. She checked the dates with the same attention she had given the balance. The earliest statements were from 16 years ago. 16 years ago, Claire had just left for college, and Douglas had been traveling to Richmond frequently, a project he described as infrastructure consulting, and she had not asked for more detail because she had trusted him. She had trusted him for 45 years. She placed the statements back on the desk in the order they had fallen. She smoothed each page. She put the folder back at the angle it had been sitting, as close as she could judge to the exact position it had occupied before her sleeve caught it. She was thorough about this. She needed him not to know. Not yet. She needed time, and time required that nothing in this room showed any evidence of having been touched. Then she went back to the kitchen and unplugged the toaster she had already unplugged and stood at the sink with both hands on the counter and looked out at the garden she had been tending for 30 years. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this with a detached curiosity, the observation of someone watching themselves from a slight remove. Her hands were not shaking because something large enough had happened that her body had moved past the shaking stage and into a different state entirely. The state of someone who has received information that reorganizes everything and is now very quietly beginning the work of reorganization. She thought about what she had just read. She thought about 16 years. She thought about the school, the rent, the pediatrician's office, the barbershop. She thought about the timing, and then she thought about her father, because her father was always where her thinking arrived when it was working through something important. Walter Greer had been a civil engineer by training and a land surveyor by practice, a man who measured things precisely and mistrusted conclusions that were not supported by measurement. He had taught Maggie to read a topographic map before she was 10 years old, spreading the large papers across the kitchen table in the farmhouse in Shenandoah County, and showing her how elevation lines told you not just what the land looked like, but what it would do when it rained, where the water would run, where the soft spots were, where the ground was reliable. He had told her that knowing your land from above was the first thing and standing on it was the second, and that you needed both to really understand what you had. He had never said anything specific about Douglas. He had never raised a concern she could point to directly. He had been courteous to Douglas at family dinners, had talked with him about football and about the news, and had maintained the civil distance of a man who was deciding something over a long period of time and had not yet finished deciding. But he had done something she had not understood at the time. 6 months before he died, Walter Greer had changed his will. He had left the farmhouse and the surrounding land in Shenandoah County, the property that had been in the Greer family for 3 generations, not to Maggie and Douglas jointly, as the previous version of his will had specified, but to Maggie alone, her name only, Margaret Elaine Greer Whitfield, as sole heir and owner. He had done this through his own attorney without discussing it with anyone. When Maggie had asked him about it afterward, he had looked at her from across the kitchen table and said simply, "The land is Greer land, and let the sentence carry whatever weight she assigned to it." She had not assigned it enough weight. She was assigning it the correct weight now. She went to her own desk in the bedroom, not the office, and found the folder where she kept her personal documents. Her copy of Walter's will was there in the same plastic sleeve it had been in since the attorney's office had sent it to her 12 years ago. She read it again. Then she read it one more time. Her name only. She put it back. She washed her face with cold water, which was not something she did in the middle of the morning. Then she went to her address book, the actual paper one, the kind no one kept anymore, and found the card she was looking for on the H page. Patricia Holt, attorney. She had handled a small personal matter for Maggie 12 years ago, a question about a property boundary near a piece of land she had inherited from an aunt. Maggie had found her efficient, precise, and not inclined to pad her hours with unnecessary conversation. The card was still there. She called and left a message, seeking for an appointment as soon as possible. Then she went back to her household accounts on the laptop and finished the work she had been doing before the toaster, because Douglas would be home at 6:30 and dinner needed to be started by 5, and because the most useful thing she could do right now was to behave exactly as she always had. Douglas came home at 6:30. She had made pot roast, which she had been slow cooking since 3 o'clock, and the house smelled of rosemary and browning meat when he came through the door. He kissed her cheek and asked about her day, and she told him about the toaster, and he said he would pick up a new one on the weekend. They talked about Claire's upcoming visit and about a neighbor's renovation project that had been going on since spring, and about a book he was partway through. She listened and responded and passed the bread basket and refilled his water glass, and she watched him across the table with the careful attention of someone seeing a familiar thing for the first time with clear eyes. He looked the same. That was the thing she kept returning to in the days that followed. He looked entirely the same. The same ease in his shoulders, the same way of tilting his head when he was considering something, the same laugh that began in his eyes before it reached his mouth, a laugh she had loved for 45 years, that she had pointed out to Claire. When Claire was small, "Look at how your father laughs. That is what a person who is genuinely happy looks like." She had thought that laugh was evidence of something. She was reconsidering what it was evidence of. She slept beside him that night. She did not lie awake. This surprised her, and then it did not, because she understood that she had passed through the first stage of what she was feeling in the kitchen that afternoon, and was now in a different stage, the stage of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to act on it, and waiting when you know what you are waiting for is surprisingly peaceful. Patricia Holt called back the next morning. The appointment was Thursday. In the 2 days between the phone call and the meeting, Maggie did what she had always done when managing a complicated situation. She gathered information. She was careful about it and methodical, and she moved through the familiar rhythms of Douglas's schedule with the efficiency of someone who has spent 45 years learning exactly when a space would be empty and how long it would stay that way. She photographed the bank statements on Wednesday morning while Douglas was at the office using her phone and getting each page in clear level light the way her father had taught her to photograph survey documents consistently and without shadow. Then she looked for the key to the filing cabinet. She had found it 11 years ago during the flooding after a bad storm, when she had been going through the drawers in Douglas's office looking for the insurance documents they needed. She had picked it up, recognized it as the cabinet key, formed the intention of mentioning it to Douglas, and then thought better of creating an awkward moment over something that didn't seem to matter. She had put it in her jewelry box in the small inner compartment where she kept things she might need later and didn't have a better place for. She had not thought about it since. She took it out and went to the filing cabinet. She opened it with steady hands, which did not surprise her. The anger was there underneath everything, a solid and permanent presence that she had recognized on the first day and had decided to treat as useful rather than disruptive. Anger, when you are not afraid of it, becomes a kind of clarity. The files were organized in Douglas's system, which she had never had reason to understand before. She worked through them deliberately. Most of what she found was what she expected: project files, client documents, financial records she had not known about, but which were consistent with the kind of business he ran. And then in the back section of the bottom drawer, she found what she had not expected: a folder of documents related to the Shenandoah property, her property, the land her father had left to her and to her alone. The documents inside included several pages with her signature on them. She studied the signatures carefully. They were good, they were not perfect. She had looked at her own signature every day for 70 years, and she could see in the way the M connected to the A in Margaret a slight difference from the way she actually formed that connection. Slight enough that a busy county records office would have no reason to question it. Not slight enough to survive a document examiner. She kept reading. There was a letter from a geological survey company addressed to Douglas at a post office box she had not known he maintained, describing what they called preliminary findings on the Greer family land in Shenandoah County. The letter was technical, but she read it through twice and understood the substance of it. There was something in the lower fields that the company considered worth investigating further. Behind the survey letter was a printed email chain between Douglas and someone identified only by a work email address named Sandra Wills. The subject line was Respring Timeline. The most recent message from Douglas read, "We need M to sign before the end of Q2. Work on the relationship angle. She trusts people she's known a long time." Maggie read this email twice also. She noted the date. She noted the name. She photographed everything she had found, replaced each document exactly where she had taken it from, closed and locked the cabinet, and returned the key to her jewelry box. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and allowed herself for approximately 4 minutes to feel the full weight of what the email meant. Not just the forged signatures, not just the secret account, the second family, the 16 years. Those things were enormous, and she had known them since Tuesday. But the email was different. The email told her that the plan to take her land had not been impulsive or opportunistic. It had been coordinated. It had involved other people, and it had been specifically designed around the calculation that she could be managed through trust, that the people she had known longest were her vulnerability, and that her trust in them could be used to move her in whatever direction Douglas needed her to move. She had been studied. Her own character had been mapped and leveraged. She sat with that for the full 4 minutes. Then she stood up, washed her hands at the kitchen sink, and started making a shopping list because they were out of coffee and she needed to think about what to make for dinner. Patricia Holt's office was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Fairfax, a firm small enough to still have a receptionist who knew clients by name, but established enough that the waiting room had real art on the walls instead of prints. Patricia herself was 62, with the quality common to attorneys who have practiced family and property law for decades. A stillness that was not passivity, but attention. The focused receptivity of someone who has learned that the first thing a client tells you is rarely the most important thing. She was wrong about that with Maggie. Maggie laid everything on the table in the order it had happened: the folder, the bank statements, the cabinet, the forged signatures, the geological survey letter, the email from Sandra Wills. She presented it the way her father had taught her to present a survey finding: start with the land itself, then the measurements, then the conclusions, the measurement support. Patricia did not interrupt. She read each document Maggie set before her with the careful silence of someone cataloging in real time. When Maggie finished, Patricia was quiet for a moment longer. Then she said the signature on these property documents. You are certain it is not yours. Maggie said, I have never signed anything related to that property. My father left it to me. I have never discussed selling it, surveying it, or doing anything with it because no one has ever discussed those subjects with me. Patricia said, I need you to understand what you are describing. A forged signature on property documents is criminal fraud. Combined with the concealed accounts and the financial activity over 16 years, you have a significant legal matter in front of you. I also need you to know that this process will take time. Divorce proceedings, fraud investigation, property protection. These do not happen quickly. Maggie said, I have been patient for 45 years. I can manage a little longer. They discussed the timeline. Patricia recommended filing for divorce on Monday. She recommended serving the papers at Douglas's office rather than at home. And when she explained the practical reasons for this, the control of environment, the removal of his home advantage, Maggie nodded and said she had already been thinking along those lines. Patricia looked at her with the expression of someone adjusting an initial assessment. They agreed on Monday. Maggie stood to leave and then turned back at the door. Patricia, she said, his assistant is involved. There is a woman named Sandra Wills at his firm who coordinated with him on the plan to get me to sign the property documents. I want you to know that now because I expect she will become relevant later. Patricia wrote the name down without visible reaction, which Maggie recognized as a professional rather than a personal response. She had chosen the right lawyer. The afternoon before the papers were served, Diane Colton knocked on Maggie's front door at 10 in the morning unannounced. Diane had been her friend for 30 years since they had met in a neighborhood book club that neither of them still attended, and that had served primarily as the introduction point for a friendship that had outlasted the club by decades. She was standing on the doorstep with an expression that Maggie recognized as rehearsed sincerity, the look of someone who has practiced what they are going to say. Maggie opened the door and waited. Diane said that Douglas had called her, that he was worried about Maggie, that he had mentioned she seemed to be going through something difficult and not quite herself lately, and that he thought it might be helpful if Diane came by to check on her. He had mentioned, Diane added, shifting slightly, that he thought a conversation with a doctor might also be worth considering. Maggie looked at her friend for a moment. She thought about what it meant that Douglas had made this call. He was building a record. A worried husband concerned friends the suggestion of instability, a reference to doctors. He was constructing a preemptive narrative about a wife who was not well, who should perhaps not be entirely trusted, whose account of events might be colored by whatever was wrong with her. It was methodical. It was the action of someone who had understood that the best defense was a narrative established early. She said, Diane, I want to ask you something directly. Are you here because you are worried about me or because Douglas asked you to come? Diane did not answer immediately. That was enough. Maggie said, I need you to go home. Not unkindly, but completely. She closed the door and locked it, and then she sat down at the kitchen table and wrote out the details of the visit in a notebook she had started keeping 2 days earlier. Date, time, what was said, what was implied, everything. Because Maggie had understood since the moment she read that email in the filing cabinet that she was in a situation where documentation was not optional. It was the foundation. She packed that afternoon. Clothes for 2 weeks. The box of family photographs from the shelf in the living room, the pictures of her parents of Claire at various ages, the record of a life before she understood how much of it had been built on ground that was not as solid as it looked. Her mother's silver hairbrush. The folder with her personal documents, including the copy of her father's will, her laptop, her phone charger. She went to the kitchen counter and took off her wedding ring. She set it at the exact center of the marble surface, the way you place something when you want it to be found and understood. Then she picked up her keys and her bag and walked out of the house at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and she did not look back as she drove down the street. Not because she felt nothing, but because she had already said her goodbye to that place in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her hands where she had stood when she first understood what she was dealing with, and a second goodbye would not have added anything true. She was on Route 66 heading west when her phone lit up on the passenger seat. A message from Patricia. She read it at the next red light. The divorce papers had been served at 12:50 at Douglas's office. His lawyers had already called. They were requesting an immediate freeze on all shared assets, including the Shenandoah property. Patricia needed to speak with her as soon as possible. Maggie read the message again. Douglas had retained counsel before the papers were even served, which meant he had known or suspected or had prepared for this possibility in a way that spoke to the kind of careful long-term calculation she was only now understanding he was capable of. He was moving to freeze the land, her land, the land her father had spent the last months of his life arranging so that it would be safe. She placed the phone back on the seat and merged onto the highway and drove west toward the mountains. Her father had not built a wall around that hidden box and written that letter and changed his will without understanding that what he was protecting it from was real. He had understood. He had done everything he could with the time he had. Now it was her turn. She called Patricia Holt somewhere past Gainesville with the Blue Ridge still an hour ahead of her and the afternoon light coming in low and flat across the highway. She did not pull over. She had learned over a long life that certain conversations were better conducted in motion when the body had something to do and the mind could work without the distraction of sitting still and waiting. Patricia answered on the second ring. Maggie told her about the freeze request without preamble. Patricia said she had already received the formal notice. She said the opposing argument would hinge on whether the Shenandoah property could be characterized as a marital asset despite the will, and that Douglas's lawyers would likely point to the years of marriage during which the property had existed nominally within the household, even if Maggie had never done anything with it. Maggie said, "I have Walter's will in my bag, the original recording copy with the county seal, and I have something else." Patricia waited. Maggie said, "When I get to the house, I need you to be ready to move fast. I think my father left documentation on the property. I don't know exactly what it is yet, but I think it exists, and I think it will change the scope of what we're dealing with." There was a pause. Patricia said, "How certain are you?" Maggie said, "Certain enough that I drove 6 hours instead of staying to watch the papers get served." Another pause shorter. Patricia said, "Call me as soon as you find it, whatever time it is." The mountains appeared when she crossed into Warren County, the long ridge of Massanutten rising to the south and the main body of the Shenandoah Range ahead of her, and the color on them was the color she had not seen in 30 years, that particular Virginia autumn combination that was neither orange nor gold, but something between the two that existed only here in this valley in this specific angle of October light. She had described it to people over the years and never quite gotten it right because it was not a color you could name, only one you could recognize when you saw it again after a long absence, the way you recognize a voice you haven't heard since childhood. She turned onto the county road and then onto the gravel track without needing to look for landmarks. Her hands knew the turns before her mind had finished processing them. Some things learned young did not require retrieval. They simply remained waiting for the moment when you needed them again. The house was standing. She had allowed herself somewhere around Luray to consider the possibility that it might not be. 30 years was a long time for a structure to sit with no one attending to it, and she had heard of farmhouses that went faster than anyone expected. Roofs collapsing inward in a single bad winter, foundations settling in ways that were survivable for decades, and then suddenly were not. But Walter Greer had built to his own standards, which were the standards of a man who measured twice and never cut corners on the materials that would be hidden inside the walls where no one would see them, but where everything depended on them. The house was standing. The roof needed attention on the north slope. The left side of the porch had settled and pulled away from true. The windows were filmed over with the slow accumulation of years. The garden her mother had cultivated with such careful attention to sequence and color, knowing which plants would carry the summer and which would take over in fall, had been entirely reclaimed by the wild tall grass and bramble where there had been order. But the walls were straight, the chimney was intact. The foundation, as far as she could see from the driveway, had not moved. She sat in the car for a few minutes and looked at it, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to look at it properly before she went inside to register what she was seeing, before the seeing became familiar again and she stopped noticing it. Then she got out and went to the door. The lock was stiff. She worked the keys slowly, feeling for the mechanism without forcing it, and after a moment that required more patience than force, the tumblers turned and the door opened on hinges that needed oil but held. The smell of the house came out to meet her, that specific combination of old wood and enclosed air, and something beneath both of those that she could not name, except to say it was the smell of this house, not of houses in general, and that it was the same as it had been when she was 8 years old and came down before dawn to find her father already at the kitchen table with his coffee. She set her bag down in the front room and stood still for a moment and let the house be what it was. Then she went to work. She started with the kitchen because her father had maintained the kitchen even in the years he lived there alone, and the kitchen was therefore in the best condition and would give her the clearest indication of what the rest of the house needed. The pipes had held. The wood stove was intact and would function once she cleared the flue. The window above the sink looked out over the back field and the tree line beyond it. The same view she had looked at every morning of her childhood, and it was still there, unchanged in the way that land does not change, while everything built on top of it does. She found the toolbox in the pantry exactly where her father had always kept it, organized in a system that she recognized immediately: power tools on the upper shelf, arranged left to right by size hand tools below, arranged by material, worked wood, metal, masonry. A man who was serious about his work kept his tools this way, not for show, but because a system that made sense meant you could find what you needed without thinking about it. And when you were not thinking about finding the tool, you were thinking about the work. She made 2 phone calls before dark: Patricia to confirm she had arrived, and Claire. Claire had been calling since Monday with increasing frequency, and Maggie had let all of them go to voicemail, not because she was avoiding her daughter, but because she had needed these first days to be entirely herself without the weight of managing someone else's fear of what was happening. She loved Claire without reservation. But love in her experience did not require sacrificing the time you needed to do something important. She expected Claire to be frightened. She expected the rapid questions, the "are you okay?" the "where are you?" the "what is happening?" What she had not fully anticipated was the anger. Claire said, "Mom, I have been calling you for 3 days." Maggie said, "I know, sit down. I need to tell you everything." She told it the way she had told Patricia, in order without abbreviating the hard parts. The folder, the bank statements, the 16 years, the Richmond family, the cabinet, the forged signatures, the email with Sandra Wills's name on it, the geological survey letter, the divorce papers, Patricia Holt, the freeze request, the drive. Claire was quiet through most of it, the kind of quiet Maggie recognized, not shock but absorption, the mind receiving something large and working to find the structure of it. Then Claire said, "He has other children." Maggie said, "2, based on the school records and the statements. A boy and a girl." Claire said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Mom, did you know? Before you found the folder, did you ever suspect?" This was the question Maggie had known was coming and had spent 3 days preparing an honest answer to, because Claire deserved honesty and not management. She said, "I trusted him, and that trust was used against me. Whether I should have seen something and chose not to, I genuinely don't know. But I did not know." Claire said, "I'm angry at you." Maggie said, "I know." Claire said, "Not because you didn't know, because you spent 45 years showing me that a good marriage looked like yours. And now I don't know what I learned." Maggie sat with that. It was the most honest thing Claire had ever said to her, and it required an honest response, which meant it required a response she did not have ready. She said, "I don't know how to answer that yet, but I think you learn that you stay when things are hard, and I think that's a complicated thing to have learned from a marriage that turned out to be what mine was." Claire said, "I'm coming this weekend." Maggie said, "I'll have the guest room ready." She did not sleep easily that first night, which was the first honest thing her body had done in 4 days. She lay in her old room in the bed with the new sheets she had brought because she had known the house would need them, and she looked at the ceiling she had looked at for the first 18 years of her life, and she let herself be uncertain for a while, not about the decisions she had made. Those felt correct in the way that things feel correct when they are aligned with what you actually know, rather than with what you had convinced yourself was true. She was uncertain about what came after, about what it meant to be 70 years old and starting from a place she had not stood in 3 decades, about whether the thing she was building here was something she could actually finish. She was still working on that question when she fell asleep. She was in the kitchen on the fourth afternoon, the same afternoon she had spent the morning helping the roofer the hardware store had recommended to assess the north slope damage when she found the brick. She had not been looking for it. That was the detail she would return to afterward, the one that felt important whenever she tried to understand how things like this happened, how the things you need find you when you are not looking for them. Or perhaps because you are not looking for them. She had been cleaning the inside of the upper cabinets with a damp cloth, a practical task necessary requiring nothing more than attention to the surface in front of her. The chimney breast ran along the kitchen wall beside the stove, the same red brick her grandfather had laid in 1924, and she had been working along it with the cloth when she noticed the difference. One brick sat slightly out of plane with the surrounding surface, not dramatically, not in any way that would have drawn the attention of a casual observer or a home inspector or anyone who had not spent 30 years learning to look at brick construction the way an engineer's daughter learns to look at brick construction. But the mortar around it was younger than the mortar beside it, a different color, a slightly different texture. And when she set the cloth down and ran her finger along the edge, the brick moved. She stood still for a moment. Then she went to the pantry and found the toolbox. She chose a flathead screwdriver and worked the brick exactly as her father had worked things that required patience. Steady pressure from the right angle, no forcing, letting the material tell you where it wanted to give. The brick came out. Behind it was a cavity in the wall, perhaps 12 inches deep and 8 wide, the deliberate kind that is made during construction and plastered over afterward, not accidental, not structural, but purposeful. And inside the cavity was a tin box. It was the kind of tin made in an era when tins were made to last. No label, no marking on the outside. It had been placed in the cavity with care, oriented, so the lid faced outward and the seal on it was tight. The seal of something closed with intention, by someone who understood that intentions could outlast the person who held them if the right container was chosen. Maggie carried it to the kitchen table. She sat down. She put the tin in front of her and looked at it for a moment without opening it, the way her father had always paused before opening something that contained information he expected to be significant. She understood that the tin had been put there for her specifically, not because she had any evidence of that, yet not because her name was on it, but because she knew her father's quality of preparation, and what was in front of her had that quality unmistakably. She put the kettle on. She waited for the water. She made tea using the same brand she had bought at the county store on her first day, because it was the brand Walter had always kept in the cabinet above the stove, and she had bought it without consciously deciding to. She sat down with the cup in front of her and the tin beside it, and she opened it. The lid was tight and required both hands in a moment of sustained pressure. But it came. Inside, the documents had been sealed in a layer of wax paper and then in a plastic sleeve, the kind of double protection used by someone who understood that paper was the most fragile thing, and that what was written on it might need to outlast the hand that wrote it by many years. The first document was a geological survey, dated 18 years ago, conducted by a company called Meridian Land Sciences out of Charlottesville. The survey covered the Greer property in its entirety, but focused specifically on the lower fields, the 40 acres that ran down from the house toward the creek. The language was technical, but the conclusions were not, and Maggie read them the way she read any technical document, starting with the executive summary, then the supporting data, then the conclusions again. Lithium. The lower field sat above a deposit of lithium-bearing spodumene ore, the geological formation from which commercial lithium was extracted. The survey described it as substantial for the region, estimated the accessible deposit at a volume that translated using the market values current at the time of the survey to a figure worth several times the assessed value of the land itself. The surveyor noted that further drilling would likely reveal additional deposits and that the initial estimate was conservative by design. Maggie set that page down and picked up the next. It was a letter in her father's handwriting addressed to his attorney Robert Alderman, dated 2 weeks after the survey. Walter's handwriting had always been the handwriting of an engineer, precise and vertical. Each letter formed completely before the next one was begun. She had not seen it in 12 years, and it arrived in her chest with a weight she had not prepared for. He wrote that he had received a telephone call from a man representing what he described as a mining interest, inquiring about the purchase of the Greer land. He had declined. He wrote that the inquiry had not struck him as random because the caller had referenced specific characteristics of the lower fields that were not public knowledge characteristics that appeared only in a recent survey. He wrote that he did not know with certainty who had commissioned that original survey, but that he had a suspicion he was not yet prepared to name directly, and that he was taking steps to protect the property regardless. He wrote that he was changing his will. He wrote that he was preparing documentation and placing it where it would be available if needed. And then at the bottom of the page, in the same precise vertical letters, he wrote the sentence that undid her. I do not know what will come, but I know my Maggie, and I know that if she ever needs this, she will know what to do with it. She put the letter down on the table. She did not cry immediately. She sat with the sentence for a moment the way you sit with something that is both a gift and a grief at the same time, something that gives you exactly what you needed and also shows you the shape of everything you had not understood. Her father had written that sentence somewhere between 18 and 20 years ago. He had been in this kitchen, at this table, in this chair, or one very close to it, writing to his attorney, while his daughter lived 4 hours away in a house he had reason not to trust. And he had written the sentence not as an accusation of anyone and not as a warning, but simply as a statement of his faith in her. The most complete faith, the kind that does not need to explain itself, that simply acts on what it knows. She pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed. Outside the window, the field was moving in the late afternoon wind, and the light was getting long, and the tree line at the far edge of the property was beginning to hold the blue shadow of early evening. She sat inside that view for a while and let her father be present in it the way certain people remain present in the places they built and cared for. Not as a supernatural thing, but as a simple fact of what it means to shape a place over a long period of time. Then she picked up the third document. It was a title search also commissioned by Walter, a thorough one that traced the chain of ownership back to her grandfather's original purchase and established without any gap or ambiguity the unencumbered ownership of the Greer property by the Greer family with Maggie as the sole documented heir. Every lien searched and cleared, every boundary confirmed, every claim that could have been made against the title already examined and found absent. Her father had not left a single thread for anyone to pull. The fourth document was a letter on Meridian Land Sciences letterhead addressed to a post office box in Richmond, forwarded to Walter by someone at the company whose name appeared only as a handwritten initial at the top of the page. The letter confirmed a second survey of the Greer property conducted the following spring. It described findings consistent with the first survey, but more specific, more confident in its estimates, more explicit about the commercial potential of the deposit. It noted that the results had been delivered to the commissioning party as requested. The commissioning party was listed by name at the top of the letter. Douglas Whitfield. Maggie read the name twice. She read the date. She read the address. She set the letter down beside the others on the kitchen table and looked at the 4 documents arranged there, each one in the order. She had removed it, and she understood what she was looking at completely. Douglas had known about the lithium for 16 years. He had commissioned his own survey the year after someone at Meridian had thought Walter should see the letter. He had known the value of what was under the lower fields at the same time he was paying tuition and rent for a family in Richmond, the same time he was managing Maggie's daily life with the careful attention of someone keeping a distance appropriate to a plan that was running in parallel at the same time he had begun evidently constructing the infrastructure of forged documents and false signatures that would allow him to acquire the land without her knowledge. Two operations running simultaneously, one domestic, one financial, both dependent on her remaining exactly as she was trusting, occupied, not looking too closely at anything that was not directly in front of her. She was not a person he had married and then betrayed. She was a position he had occupied and then managed for decades with a level of strategic patience she had not credited him with because she had not known she needed to. She sat with that understanding for a long time. The anger she had recognized since Tuesday was still there, unchanged in its fundamental nature, solid as ground. But beneath it now was something older and colder, a grief that had nothing to do with the marriage and everything to do with the specific calculation it represented. He had looked at her trust and decided it was useful. He had looked at her decency and decided it was a tool. She had been studied and she had been used, and the man who had done both those things had sat across from her at the dinner table for 45 years and looked at her with an expression she had called love. She called Patricia Holt. It was 7:40 in the evening. Patricia picked up without comment on the hour. Maggie described each document in the order she had found it. When she got to the fourth one, to the name at the top of the Meridian letter, Patricia was quiet for a beat longer than she had been during the rest of the account. Then she said, "He commissioned a geological survey of your land 16 years ago without your knowledge. He then attempted multiple times to acquire the property using forged documentation. And your father, who appears to have suspected the survey's origins, preserved direct evidence connecting Douglas to it." Maggie said yes. Patricia said, "Maggie, with the documents you have described, we are no longer discussing a divorce proceeding with fraud components. We are discussing a criminal fraud case with a civil proceeding attached to it. This changes the timeline and the strategy significantly." Maggie said, "I need the property protected first. The freeze request." Patricia said, "The title search and the original will defeat the freeze argument. I can file a response tomorrow morning, and I expect it to be resolved within 48 hours. But I want you to understand what the rest of this will look like." Maggie said, "Tell me," Patricia told her. She listened without interrupting, the way her father had listened to difficult information, as though the difficulty of the information was not a reason to resist receiving it, but simply a condition of receiving it accurately. When Patricia finished, Maggie said, "How long?" Patricia said, "A year, possibly longer. Fraud cases move at the pace of the investigation." Maggie said, "I have been patient for longer than that." She drove to the county seat the following Thursday to file the property response documents in person because she had decided at the beginning of this process that she would do every procedural thing she could do herself rather than delegate it, not from distrust of Patricia, but from the understanding that presence mattered. That being the person standing at the counter made a different statement than being the name on a document delivered by someone else. She parked in the municipal lot and walked to the county clerk's office with the folder under her arm. She was at the counter when she became aware of a woman standing to her left who had just stepped up and was in conversation with the second clerk, a woman in a dark jacket, early 40s, with the specific professional bearing of someone operating in an official capacity on behalf of someone else. Maggie listened for a moment and registered the nature of the inquiry records on the Greer property, the woman representing herself as an authorized agent of the Whitfield family. Maggie placed her own folder on the counter in front of the first clerk and said, before the clerk could speak, "I'm Margaret Greer Whitfield. I am the legal owner of the Greer property as established by the will of Walter Greer, which is a recorded document in this county." She placed a copy of the will on the counter beside her folder. The woman in the dark jacket turned. Maggie looked at her directly. The woman was Sandra Wills. She recognized the name from the email, and now she had a face to attach to it, a face that was arranging itself with visible effort into a composed professional expression that did not quite cover the assessment happening underneath it. Maggie said, "I believe this concludes your business here today, Ms. Wills." Sandra Wills said, "Mrs. Whitfield, there are aspects of this situation that I don't think you fully understand." Maggie said, "I've read your emails. I understand the situation quite well. She turned back to the first clerk. She completed her filing without looking in Sandra Wills's direction again. She was aware of the woman leaving, could track it by the sound of footsteps in the shift of air near the door, but she did not turn to watch. She called Patricia from the parking lot. Patricia listened. There was a silence on the line that Maggie had learned to read as Patricia processing implications rather than formulating a response. Then Patricia said, "I want to be clear that I wish you had told me before doing that." Maggie said, "I know." Patricia said, "That said, I think you may have just done something useful." Sandra Wills is already in a difficult position as a participant in a fraud scheme being actively investigated. Being confronted directly in a public location with evidence that her communications have been read may accelerate a decision she was already facing about where her loyalty is better placed. Maggie said, "That was my assessment also." There was another brief silence. Patricia said, "You should have been a lawyer." Maggie said, "I considered it at 22. Douglas thought it was impractical." She paused. "That tells you something, doesn't it?" She drove back to the farm in the late afternoon with the windows down, letting the cool October air move through the car, and she thought about Sandra Wills's face when she had turned and found Maggie already at the counter, the moment of recognition, the adjustment of expression. She thought about the email she had photographed in the filing cabinet, the instruction to work on the relationship angle she trusts people she has known a long time. She thought about what it meant that Douglas had needed to instruct someone else to manage her, had needed to enlist help to arrange her into position, and she thought that said something important about what he had understood about her without ever quite acknowledging it to himself. He had understood that she was not easy to move. He had simply found the angles that she had not been watching. She was watching all of them now. Bob Mercer was sitting on the low stone wall at the edge of the property when she turned onto the gravel track, which was not something she had expected to see at 5 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. He was a broad-shouldered man with the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his adult life outdoors, and he stood when she parked unhurried with the patience of someone who has been waiting and does not mind having waited. She rolled down the window. He said, "I heard you were at the county building today." She said, "Word travels fast out here." He said, "It always has." He looked at the folder visible on the passenger seat. He said, "Someone was asking about your property at the clerk's office before you got there." She said, "I'm aware." He said, "I thought you should know. I told them at the counter that the woman who came in wasn't anyone from your family that I knew of. I've lived here 30 years. They know me." Maggie looked at him for a moment. She said, "That was useful. Thank you." He nodded. He said, "The roofer I sent you, did he do a good job?" She said, "He did. The north slope is sorted. He's coming back next week for the gutters." Bob Mercer said, "Good." He pushed off the wall. He said, "Without looking at her, I owe you a better introduction than the one I gave you the first day." He walked back toward the road without waiting for a response, which was the kind of apology that men of his generation and disposition made brief and unembellished in meaning exactly what it said. She watched him go. Then she got out of the car and carried her folder inside and made dinner and sat at her father's table in the kitchen that her father had maintained and looked out the window at the field where the lithium lay under 40 acres of Virginia earth, waiting with the particular patience of things that have existed for millions of years and are not in a hurry. 3 days later, Patricia called with news that was not unexpected, but arrived at the precise moment Maggie needed confirmation of something she had been working toward without knowing whether it would hold. Sandra Wills had contacted the investigators. Sandra Wills had not contacted the investigators out of conscience. Patricia made that clear in the same call where she delivered the news because Patricia understood that Maggie needed accurate information more than she needed a satisfying story. And the accurate information was this: Sandra Wills was a woman who had looked at the evidence arrayed against her and made a calculation. The calculation had not been difficult. Douglas's financial structure was collapsing under the weight of its own exposure, and Sandra Wills had understood the moment Maggie appeared at the county clerk's counter with Walter's will already in hand that the person she had been working for did not have the resources to protect her from what was coming. She had called the investigators 4 days after the county clerk encounter. She provided emails. She provided calendar records of meetings that had no official documentation. She provided a handwritten note from Douglas outlining the sequence of steps required to move the Shenandoah property into a jointly titled instrument without triggering Maggie's awareness. The note was in Douglas's handwriting. Patricia described it as a kind of document that defense attorneys spent careers trying to explain away and rarely succeeded. Maggie received all of this information standing at the kitchen window, watching the first frost of the season settle over the backfield, whitening the grass in a slow, even spread that moved from the tree line toward the house as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. She listened to Patricia's voice, and she watched the frost move, and she understood that what she was hearing was not the end of something, but the point at which the outcome became inevitable, which was a different thing entirely. Inevitable was not the same as finished. It was simply the place where you could stop spending energy on uncertainty and redirect it toward what came next. She said, "How long before the criminal referral?" Patricia said, "The investigators have what they need, 3 to 6 months before charges, most likely. The civil proceedings run on a separate track." Maggie said, "And the property?" Patricia said, "The freeze request was denied 2 weeks ago. The property is yours uncontested. That part is settled." Maggie said, "Good. Then let's talk about what I do with it." Claire arrived on a Friday evening in late October with James, who had the quality Maggie valued most in people her daughter chose to be with, the quality of someone who entered a room and assessed it before deciding how much space to take up in it. He shook Maggie's hand at the door and looked at the house with genuine interest, and then went to help bring the bags in without being asked. And that was enough for her to know the important thing about him. They had dinner at the kitchen table, the three of them, and the conversation moved the way conversations move when people who care about each other are also being careful with each other. Not dishonest, but measured feeling for the ground before committing full weight. James asked about the restoration work, and Maggie told him about the roof and the porch and the furnace, and he asked specific follow-up questions that told her he was actually listening rather than performing interest. Claire was quieter than usual, not closed but containing something. After dinner, James said he was going to sit by the fire in the front room with his book, which Maggie recognized as an act of deliberate consideration, giving the two of them the kitchen without having to ask for it. She appreciated it without saying so. Some things were better received in silence. Claire sat across the table from her with a cup of tea and was quiet for a moment in the way Maggie had always recognized in her daughter the particular stillness of someone who is choosing their words not for effect, but for accuracy. The fire moved in the wood stove. The kitchen held the warmth of the meal they had just eaten. Claire said, "I've been thinking about what I said on the phone, about not knowing what I learned from watching your marriage." Maggie said, "I've been thinking about it too." Claire said, "I want to take it back, not because it wasn't true, but because I think I was making your marriage about me, and it wasn't. It was yours. And what you built here in the last 3 months, that's yours too. And I think I needed to see it in person to understand that those are two separate things." Maggie looked at her daughter across the table. Claire was 41 years old and had her grandfather's eyes, the particular steadiness of them, the quality of looking at something without flinching from what it actually was. Maggie had not noticed until this moment how completely that had passed through, not diluted but direct Walter Greer's way of seeing things transmitted across 2 generations without losing anything essential. She said, "Your grandfather would have liked James." Claire smiled, the first full smile of the evening. She said, "James thinks the porch repair is extraordinary work. He kept looking at the beam joints when we came in." Maggie said Bob Mercer's crew did the structural work. "I painted it." Claire said, "You painted the porch." Maggie said, "I painted the whole downstairs interior." She paused. It turns out that when you are deciding what color to put on a wall, and there is no one whose preference you need to account for, you choose differently than you thought you would. Claire looked around the kitchen, taking in the color Maggie had chosen, a warm cream that was close to, but not exactly the color the walls had been when Walter lived here, slightly lighter, acknowledging the original without simply reproducing it. She said, "It's right." Maggie said, "I thought so." They sat for a while longer without talking, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that becomes available between people when they have said the difficult things and arrive somewhere that doesn't require more words immediately. Outside the kitchen window, the frost that had started in the back field had reached the garden bed along the south wall of the house, and in the morning Maggie would find it crystallized on the new bulbs she had planted 2 weeks earlier, the first evidence of what would come up in April. 3 months had passed since she had driven the 6 hours from Fairfax. In those 3 months, she had replaced a roof section, releveled. A porch installed a new furnace, repainted every interior surface, repaired 14 windows, rebuilt the cold frame at the edge of the kitchen garden, and begun the longer project of reclaiming her mother's plantings from the decade and a half of neglect that had taken them over. She had also hired a geologist. Dr. Ann Forsyth worked out of the University of Virginia's Earth Sciences Department and had a professional reputation that Patricia had described as exceptional and that Maggie had confirmed through her own research before making the call. She had spent 4 days on the lower fields in September with a small crew, and she had sat down with Maggie at this same kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon and laid out her findings on paper with the careful language of someone who did not want to promise more than the data supported, but who could not in good conscience promise less than it clearly did. She had used the word substantial. She had used the phrase rare for this region. She had provided a range of values that accounted for current market conditions and projected demand trajectories. And the lower end of that range was a number that Maggie had looked at twice, not because it was difficult to believe, but because she was giving it the full attention it deserved. The deposit was larger than the survey her father had commissioned 18 years ago had indicated and more accessible. The formation sat at a depth that current extraction technology could reach without the most disruptive surface methods, which mattered to Maggie not as an abstract environmental position, but as a practical one, because the land above it was going to remain exactly what it had always been. She was not selling. She had never considered selling. What she was doing instead was what Patricia had helped her understand was possible: a licensing arrangement with a development company structured so that the extraction rights were leased for a defined period with strict operational conditions, while the land itself remained in her name, unencumbered, available to be returned to her in whatever state the conditions required the leaseholder to maintain. She had interviewed 3 companies. She had brought Bob Mercer to the final meeting with the company she was considering, not because she needed his approval, but because he had lived adjacent to this land for 30 years and understood its water table and drainage patterns in ways that no desk-based assessment could replicate. He had asked 3 questions during the meeting about groundwater monitoring protocols. The company's representative had answered 2 of them well and fumbled the third, and after the meeting, when Maggie was reviewing her notes at the kitchen table, she had added a groundwater monitoring clause to the list of non-negotiable contract terms. Bob had not said anything about that. He had simply nodded when she mentioned it the next day, in the way that people nod when something confirms what they already knew about a person. The company signed the contract in November. Patricia reviewed every clause. Maggie had reviewed them first the night before Patricia saw them, because she had made a decision at some point in the autumn that she would not delegate her own comprehension to anyone, not even the people she trusted completely. Understanding something yourself and having a professional confirm it were not the same thing, and she wanted both. The letter from Diane Colton arrived on a Wednesday in early December, forwarded from the Fairfax address where Maggie had arranged to have her mail redirected. It was handwritten on plain paper, which was the only form in which Maggie would have given it the weight it deserved, because email, she had learned, was the medium of things people said when they wanted a record of having said them without fully committing to what the saying meant. A handwritten letter on plain paper was different. It was the medium of things that cost something to say. Diane wrote that she had known about the Richmond family for 8 years. Not 16, not from the beginning, but 8 years, which meant she had known for the entire second half of the period during which Douglas had been maintaining that parallel life. A mutual acquaintance had told her. She had not told Maggie because she had been afraid of what telling would do to the marriage, to the friendship, to an arrangement of relationships that she had valued and had not wanted to disturb. She wrote that she had told herself the things people tell themselves when they are choosing not to act on what they know, that it wasn't her place, that she didn't have the full picture, that marriages were complicated, and perhaps Maggie was better served by not knowing. She wrote, "I was wrong. I knew I was wrong while I was telling myself I wasn't. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking you to have the truth from me rather than from someone else." Maggie read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning with her coffee. She read it again. She held it for a while after the second reading without putting it down, because putting it down felt like a conclusion, and she was not ready to reach one yet. 8 years. The arithmetic was specific, and she could not help doing it. 8 years ago, Claire had been 33. Maggie's mother had still been alive. There had been a period around that time when Maggie had felt something she had not been able to name, precisely a quality of distance in her daily life that she had attributed to getting older, to the natural contraction of a long marriage, to the ordinary melancholy of watching your parents decline. She had not been wrong that those things were happening. She had been wrong that they were the only things happening. She thought about what it would have meant to know 8 years ago. She thought about it honestly without softening it toward a conclusion that would be easier to live with. She thought that knowing 8 years earlier would have given her 8 more years of something, though she was not certain what. More time to prepare, more time to act, more time to be angry, possibly more time to grieve things that she had spent the past 4 months discovering she did not need to grieve as long as she had thought. She picked up the phone and called Diane. Not because she had fully processed what she felt, but because Diane deserved a direct response and not the silence of someone managing her reactions from a careful distance. Diane answered on the third ring. Her voice had the quality of someone who has been waiting for a call they were not sure would come. "Maggie said I received your letter." Diane said, "Maggie?" Maggie said, "I'm not going to tell you. It doesn't matter because it does. 8 years is a specific amount of time, and it matters in specific ways. I'm not ready to talk about what those ways are yet." Diane said, "I understand." Maggie said, "What I want you to know is that I received it, and that the telling took something, and I know it did." She paused. "I'll call you again when I know what I want to say." She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand and looked out the window at the dormant garden. She did not feel resolved. She felt honest, which was not the same thing, and was, she had come to understand over the past months, considerably more useful. Douglas came in late October, a Saturday morning, arriving unannounced on the gravel track in a rental car. Maggie saw the car from the kitchen window while she was washing her breakfast dishes, and she recognized immediately that it was not his, that the particular model he had driven for years and replaced with the same reliability every 3 years was not what had turned onto her property. A rental meant something specific about where things stood. She dried her hands. She did not hurry to the door. She stepped out onto the porch before he reached the steps because she had made a decision some weeks earlier, somewhere around the time the contract was signed, that whatever conversation eventually happened between them would happen on her ground and at her pace, and with her facing outward rather than inward. She had restored this porch, herself had chosen the paint color. Herself had stood on it on enough mornings to understand it as hers, in a way that required no further argument. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked different. Not physically diminished, he was still the same broad-shouldered man she had lived beside for 45 years. But something in the way he occupied himself had changed. The ease she had always associated with him, that settled quality of a person who believes the world is generally arranged in his favor, was absent. What had replaced it was something more careful, more aware of where he was standing and who was watching. He said her name. She said, "I wondered when you would come." He stood for a moment looking at the house. She watched him take in the restored porch, the new roof line, the repainted exterior, the garden beds along the south wall that were dormant now, but clearly tended. Clearly the work of someone who intended to be here through the seasons and beyond them. He had known this property only as a set of coordinates on a survey document, a deposit value, a line, and a strategy. He was seeing it now as what it actually was. He said, "Can we talk?" She said, "You can talk." She did not move from where she was standing. He talked for a while. She let him because she had always been a good listener and because she wanted to understand the full shape of what he had come to say before she responded to any part of it. He talked about the investigation. He talked about the financial pressure he was under, the way the collapse of the Richmond arrangement and the legal proceedings had intersected to create a situation he described with the careful vagueness of someone who has been advised by counsel as extremely difficult. He talked about mistakes using the word in the plural and the general never attaching it to anything specific. And then he got to what he had actually come to say. He needed her to speak to the investigators on his behalf. He needed her to characterize the property situation as a misunderstanding rather than a fraud. He needed, he said, looking up at her for the first time since he had started talking for her to consider the children. She looked at him when he said that, not the children in Fairfax, the children in Richmond, his other children. He had placed them between himself and what he was asking for, and she watched him do it and understood it completely, not as a manipulation that angered her, but as a tactic that revealed something she had spent 45 years not seeing clearly enough. He had always done this, had always placed something he knew she valued between himself and whatever he needed from her. The marriage, Claire, the household, her own sense of what a good person did. He had understood her character as a set of lovers and had operated them with considerable skill for a very long time. She went inside and came back with a folder. She held it out to him. She said, "This is everything. Everything your attorney has and everything mine has prepared. I want you to understand clearly what the record shows." He took it. He opened it and began to read the summary page that Patricia had prepared, the forged signatures, the concealed accounts, the survey he had commissioned on her land. Without her knowledge, the email chain with Sandra Wills's name on it, the note in his own handwriting that Sandra had provided to the investigators. She said, "I am not doing this to harm you. I am doing it because it is accurate. You spent 45 years deciding what I needed to know. This is what I have decided you need to know." She paused. She said, "The proceedings will continue. That is not something I am going to alter. I spent a long time taking care of things that were not my responsibility because I believed it was what a good partner did. I am finished with that. What happens next is yours to manage. It always should have been." She held out her hand for the folder. He gave it back. She said, "I think you should go now." He stood for a moment at the bottom of the porch steps looking up at her. She held his gaze without difficulty. There was nothing left in this moment that required her to look away, nothing unresolved that might be readable in her face, no uncertainty he could find purchase on. She had done her grief in private in the months since July, in the specific and necessary way that grief gets done when you give it the time and space it needs rather than compressing it into the gaps between other obligations. It was not gone, but it was finished in the sense that mattered, finished in the way a thing is finished when it has been fully experienced rather than merely concluded. He walked back to the Prenoam car. He sat inside it for longer than was necessary, and she waited on the porch without moving, not watching him with any particular intensity, but present, not retreating inside. Eventually, he started the engine. She watched the car move down the gravel track and turn at the road and disappear past the tree line, and the sound of the engine faded and the property settled back into its own sounds. The wind in the dry grass of the field, a crow somewhere near the creek, the distant rhythm of Bob Mercer's tractor on the far side of the ridge. She stood on the porch for a long while after he was gone. She was not celebrating. Celebration would have required a sense of victory, and victory implied a contest, and she had stopped thinking of this as a contest sometime in the autumn, when she had understood that what she was doing had never been about defeating anyone. It had been about recovering something, about returning to a place and a self that had been there all along, waiting with the particular patience of things that are rooted deeply enough to wait out whatever passes above them. The fraud case resolved the following spring. Patricia called on a Tuesday morning with the outcome, which was the outcome she had predicted, with the careful imprecision of someone who does not promise results, but who had spent 40 years developing an accurate read of how these things went. Significant financial penalties, a civil judgment that would take years to satisfy, a record that would follow Douglas Whitfield for the rest of his professional life, not as punishment exactly, but as consequence, which was a different and more honest word for what the law actually delivered. Maggie listened to the summary and asked two specific questions about the judgment terms and then said, "Thank you, Patricia. You did exceptional work." Patricia said, "So did you." She received the first royalty payment on a Thursday morning in April. She had known the payment was coming, had known the approximate amount from the contract terms, had reviewed the numbers with Patricia and with her own calculations. But she had also understood in the way you understand things that you have thought about but not yet experienced, that there was a difference between knowing a number and receiving it, between the abstract and the actual. She checked her account at the kitchen table with her coffee in the early morning light that came in from the east through the window she had replaced in September. The number on the screen was the number she had expected. She read it twice, not from disbelief, but from the same instinct that had made her father pause before opening significant information. Some things deserve to be received fully rather than absorbed in passing. Then she sat with it for a moment in the quiet kitchen. The first royalty payment from the lithium licensing contract was larger than the total amount Douglas had redirected into his secret account over 16 years. She had not planned this comparison. It arrived simply as arithmetic, the way arithmetic arrives when you have been a careful keeper of numbers for most of your adult life, and once it arrived, she let it sit without attaching more meaning to it than it had. It was not a symmetry she had engineered. It was simply what the land had always been worth waiting for the person who was supposed to receive it to be in the right position to receive it. Her father had known this. He had known the number approximately for 18 years. He had sat in his kitchen with a geological survey and a letter from his attorney and a sense of what was approaching, and he had not sold, had not leveraged, had not done the thing that the number would have made most people do. He had locked the documents in a tin box and put the tin box behind a brick and changed his will and written a sentence to his attorney about his faith in his daughter. And then he had waited with the same quality of patience that he had always brought to things that mattered. She called Claire. She said, "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing." Claire said, "He always did." There was a warmth in the silence that followed the warmth of two people who have arrived at the same understanding from different directions and are acknowledging it without needing to expand it into something larger than it was. Claire said she would come down the following weekend to help with the spring planting, and Maggie said that would be good, that the south bed was ready, and she had ordered bulbs from the same catalog her mother had used because she had found a copy of it in the desk in the front room, and the order forms were still valid. Claire said, "You found Mom's catalog," Maggie said in the second drawer. She had folded the corners on the pages she was planning to order from. "I ordered from the same pages." The bulbs came up in April exactly as her mother's always had. The sequence was her mother's sequence color, following color in the pattern she had designed over decades of knowing this particular plot of ground, its exposure and drainage, the way the shadow fell across it in different seasons. Maggie had not changed the arrangement. She had planted where her mother had planted and let the established knowledge of the place guide what went where. But she had added her own section along the north wall, a stretch of ground that had been gravel in her mother's time and that she had dug out over the winter and prepared and planted with varieties. She had chosen herself for reasons she had not fully articulated, but that felt right in the way that choices feel right when they come from what you actually want rather than from what you are trying to satisfy. By May, the garden was flowering in two registers at once, her mother's design and her own addition existing together without conflict, the older pattern providing the structure within which the newer one could establish itself. She was 71 years old. The house that her grandfather had built in 1924 was in better condition than it had been in 40 years, restored by her hands and the hands of people she had chosen and paid and learned from and argued with when the details were not right. The land that Walter Greer had protected with the full force of his careful intelligence was generating the income that would sustain it for the next generation and the one after that, under terms that she had negotiated and signed and understood in their entirety. She was not the woman who had driven away from Fairfax in July with a box of photographs and a copy of her father's will. She was not diminished from that woman. She was what that woman had always been before the decades of accommodation had required her to be smaller than her actual size, before the daily management of someone else's needs had taken up the space where her own life was supposed to go. Every morning she came down before dawn, the same way her father always had, and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the field while the light changed from gray to silver to the particular pale gold of early morning in the Shenandoah Valley. She had never been a morning person in Fairfax. She was one here. She did not analyze this. She simply got up when she woke up and went to the kitchen and made the coffee and sat in the chair that had been her father's chair, and she was in those mornings exactly and completely herself. The lithium was in the lower fields, invisible from the kitchen window, beneath 40 acres of Virginia earth that her grandfather had farmed and her father had surveyed and protected, and that she now managed with the authority of someone who had earned it not by inheritance alone, but by the harder process of understanding what she had and deciding what it was for. Walter Greer had not been a man who said things he could not demonstrate. He had not told Maggie he loved her without also showing her the form that love took when it was serious, when it was the kind of love that lasted beyond the person who felt it and went on working after they were gone. He had shown her how to read the land. He had shown her how to measure before concluding. He had shown her in the end what it looked like when a person did everything in their power to protect someone they trusted absolutely without asking anything from that person in return, without even telling them it was happening. She had found it. She had done what he knew she would do with it. She sat at his table every morning in his house on his land, and she felt the shape of that, the particular quality of being known and trusted by someone who had seen her clearly, not the version of her that 45 years of marriage had required, but the actual version, the one that had always been there underneath the accommodations, the one that could read a contract and negotiate its terms and paint a porch and plant a garden and stand on that porch and tell the truth to a man who had spent decades arranging for her not to know it. Her father had seen that woman. He had built something for her to come home to. She had come home.